Have you ever felt trapped? You can get to that point where you lose hope. The people of Europe were feeling this way in the 1200s, but by the 1400s, a spark of hope had ignited them. Let's find out why. I chose starting my podcast at the year 1200 so that we could have a broader knowledge base to understand our world today, people we meet and hear about, and the events that are happening from the news. Even AI influences our convictions. We have to decipher what is true and filter through all that. It was like that back in the 1200s, too, kind of, without the AI. Um, I wanted to start today's podcast with a story from my childhood. I need my glasses to do this. Everyone else slept in, did something fun at the park, or went swimming, but not my family. Oh no. We knew what to expect on Memorial Day. It was a tradition, the routine and the repetitiveness of it that bored me as a teenager. My parents were so predictable on that weekend. Mother saved tall pineapple juice cans all year long for this day. She covered them with aluminum foil. We used to call them tin foil. These became the disposable flower pots for many graves that we would visit that day. Dad also planned ahead, way ahead. He planted peonies and rose bushes and lilacs, iris and spring flowers, years ahead. And then we had flowers for the graves. Dad and Mother got up early, cut and arranged these flowers, giving them their destination, such as, oh, these would look nice on Great Grandma Bolden's grave, don't you think? Well, we all piled in the car with the best smelling trunk in town and headed for our old farming town that we lived in when I was a little girl. We would arrive so that we could see the veterans of foreign war raise the flag and hear it play the bugle. This ceremony, after this ceremony, we started our pilgrimage through the cemetery. Each grave had a story, each grave was treated with reverence, and each ancestor was honored that day. Um, after at every stop, my parents instilled in me a gratitude for my good name and the efforts of so many that their lives had made my life so full and abundant. Through my bouncing, running around childhood, they held my hand. And through my bored exterior of let's get this over with teenager, they patiently retold the stories. I emerged a grateful adult who had been taught not only subconsciously, that if only subconsciously, that each of my ancestors were a bit of me. I have more than my great grandmother's eye color or my grandpa Crane's hair color. I have faith in God, a free country to live in, a work ethic, recognition of importance of education, musical abilities, yummy recipes, and the tradition of putting a tablecloth on for meals. I didn't create my lifestyle myself. A large part of it was given to me by these noble ancestors who used for me to use and enlarge upon. I hope to thank them after this life and report that I've done well with their name. Our families make a big impact on our personal value system, and other people do too. We hear and read about them, and they will send a spark of hope to your mind and your heart. And our ancestors were influenced by the people we're going to talk about today. The British history framed our part of our Constitution, and so we're going to recap on that a little bit. In 55 BC, the Romans invaded England and took control. They left Roman soldiers to govern and collect taxes and to control everyone. If they had very little freedoms. They set up a tyranny cycle. It became hard to fight against tyranny when you are just making do to exist and you're in survival mode. This is where the English were. 250 years later, the Vikings invaded and controlled the eastern part of England. The leadership there was of two brothers, and their names were Hengist and Horsa. Oh, yes, there was a mother and a father that named their children these names. Hengist and Horsa were wonderful men. They believed in freedom and freedom under laws, so people were accountable for their behaviors. And they had an influence on the Magna Carta with how they set up government in that part of England. Thomas Jefferson was so impressed by them that he wanted to put their faces on the first coins minted in the U.S. And this is a picture of, if I can get it back in with me, a picture of what he wanted it to look like, the Hengist and Horsa coin. After that, in the year, about 500 years later, in the year 870 AD, Alfred the Great appeared in the picture in England. He was Queen Elizabeth's 32nd great-grandfather. He established the Anglo-Saxon government using the best ideas from Rome, the Vikings' ideas, and the scriptures he had access to at the time. Alfred was great because he brought Christian values to the people, such as the Ten Commandments. He built churches, which doubled for schools. He unified small towns and made England stronger. He established a military, and he ruled fairly for his people. But after generations of kings, they had good kings and bad kings. And they had good barons and bad barons. But it gradually became that they had less good ones and more bad rulers over them. The barons were the landowners, and they got power hungry too, along with the kings. And they started the tyranny cycle again. The Magna Carta changed all that. And this is what the Magna Carta was based on. When William Marshall, we talked about him last time, was helping to construct the Magna Carta, they used people's law as their template for their setting up their government. People's law was like this. In the time of the Bible, there was a time of Moses. If you remember, Moses led the people by parting the Red Sea into the wilderness, where they spent their next time having a 40-year walkabout. And everybody would bring their problems to Moses, their leader. This was stressful for Moses and counterproductive as well, as the people lined up day after day. And then Moses' father-in-law offered him some good advice. He told him to organize the people and appoint leaders over them. So Moses set up a people's law pyramid, like the one I just showed you, this one. It's noticed the people have the most power at the top, and they're governed by 10 families has a leader, every 50 families has a leader, every 100 families, every 1,000 families have a leader. And then they had elected officials, but in Moses's case, it was people who Moses asked to help him. And then there was Moses down here, but they put in elected officials and a king down there. And this was the Anglo-Saxon government. That process was used in the Magna Carta. They believed that people did have rights. I was a poor example as a child. about this very thing, learning to give other people their agencies. I had a doll buggy and I loved it. And I would put my dolls in it and take them for a walk. But what I really loved to do was put wiggly, squirmy little kittens in my doll clothes and then wrap them up really tight in a little blanket and lay them in my buggy. And I would sing to them and I would take them for walks, and they would try so hard to squirm out of there, and they would eventually get out of that blanket. And when they did, I was prepared. I had a stick with me and I would whack them on the head, and then they would stay inside my buggy for me. Now, when I was an adult, my the youngest of our 10 children, was a little girl, and she loved baby kittens that were out by our farmhouse. And I watched her one day as she went out and played with them and hugged them and petted them and brought them food and a bowl of milk. And as she got up to leave, they would scamper behind her and follow her. And they just loved her. Not so with me. When I was a little girl and I came out the door to the outside, every cat in any that saw me went scampering for some protection someplace to get away from me. So I kind of can relate a little bit to the idea of these people being, having a stick to hit the people over the head to get them to do what they wanted them to do. And that's not a good way to lead people. Every person has an agency. Every person's voice matters. You matter. So who you elect to voice your opinion matters. If you have courage, if they have courage and integrity, they'll do well by you. Are you starting to see the mind shift that was happening and inspired people with hope and yearning for freedom with the Magna Carta? Where are we today with these triangles of a people's law versus a ruler's law? Where are we today? Are we letting our rights being governed well? Let's continue to learn about that and what the Founding Fathers did about solid truths that allow us the best laws for our future. Today we will focus on the 13 and the 1400s now, and there were a few people during this time frame that did put a spark in the minds of the people that ignited their thoughts of freedom. When I was in school and first started school in the first grade in the little farming town we lived in, I went to a 2-room schoolhouse. The one classroom had grades 1 through 3, and the other classroom had 4 through 6. And in this little school, the classrooms were by each other, and on the other side of the school, there was another big open room, and it was filled with supplies and with geraniums that weathered over the winter inside and then were planted in the spring. And the school always smelled like geraniums. There was a large open area in the middle with a hardwood floor, and we played games there sometimes. And then there was a boys and a girls bathroom. And yes, we had running water. We weren't that primitive. So anyway, in this 2-room school, I went my first day of school in first grade, and the teacher taught us the Pledge of Allegiance. And when she taught us the Pledge of Allegiance, she taught us to have a reverence for the flag and be grateful for the freedoms that we have. This was right after World War II, and there was a great amount of reverence for the flag because so many had lost family members in that war. I had lost a family member, my uncle, and my teacher had lost some of her family in that war as well. So it really felt close to home when we pledged allegiance to that flag. And somehow standing and putting my hand over my heart and pledging allegiance like I really meant it was instilled in me as just, I've had this all my life, a love for freedom that flag represents. And so I think having thoughts for freedom is what will make things better for your life and for our future as a country as well. This teacher sparked my personal feelings for freedom. And there are other people in the world who did too. Now, back in the 1300s, Marco Polo was one of those people. He was born in 1254 AD in Venice, Italy. He died at age 69, an old life that he lived during those years. His father and uncle were jewelers and wealthy men, and they traveled the Silk Road to China and met Kublai Khan and the grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan asked them to return home and asked the Pope to send missionaries to teach him about Christianity and return with the missionaries. So they did, and when they came, they brought 17-year-old Marco Polo with them too. Marco spoke 4 languages, very intelligent. He was very charismatic, and he fit in with the royal family. The Khan and his son liked him, and they used him to converse with other countries they were doing dealings with because of his languages. Marco traveled a lot in China, and he saw firsthand how they lived. He spent 24 years there, and then he accompanied a princess of the Khan family to Persia for an arranged political marriage. And when he did that, he left the soldiers and the people that were there with this woman, and he went back home to France to Venice because he was halfway there. Venice was at war then, so he fought on a ship and was captured. Funny how traumatic events in our lives can change the course of our lives, because this was a changing factor. When he went in prison, he told the inmates all his story about his China adventures, and they were enthralled to listen to them. And one educated man that was in the prison with him helped Marco write down his stories, and later it was published. So this book and all the released inmates told these stories, and it spread like wildfire all over Europe, and it changed Europe. Marco had introduced Europe to a postal system like our old Pony Express. That's what they used in China. And ordinary people were able to get information from one place to another and contact people and friends that lived in other cities. He told them about the secret to making silk, because the Chinese had done a good job of keeping it a secret for a long time, but he exposed it. It was the silkworm that they were using for their threads. He taught them how to use different alloys to better use make metal tools and armament. He said they used paper money in China because it was easier than carrying around the heavy coins. He told them that black stuff that was in the ground there in Europe was coal, and it could be burned, and so they didn't have to tear down as much of their forest as they were used to stay warm. And they started mining. Marco told them about eyeglasses and how you could make a lens that would help you be able to see better. and about the more sophisticated culture that the Chinese had at the time. Many explorers were inspired by these fascinating adventures, and Europeans started thinking of creative ways to better their lives. A desire for freedom to do that came, and because at this time, if you had a trade that you knew and you had to belong to the king's guild and use the tools he said you had to use and trade where he said and charge what he said. People didn't like this kind of control over them. Now, they were just starting to get this little desire for freedom. And then in 1315, a great famine happened. There was a volcanic eruption in the Arctic, and it changed the weather patterns for all of Europe. It was 2 really hard, cold winters and very wet, and their summers were cold and wet also. No crops could be grown. The vegetation was dying because it was just drowning in all this wet soil. It meant no food. The sheep and the cattle died, up to 80% of them. This led to crime, to cannibalism and infant killing. It was a tough time to try to be alive. Millions starved to death, and they were experiencing a big setback for their search for freedom. And then a few years later, the Black Death happened. It started in Genoa and the trading ports that they had with Chinese ships. And these Chinese ships had black rats on them, and they had fleas that carried the bubonic plague. The population dropped 42% even after that. So now we have a lot of people who have died in Europe in this last 100 years. The bubonic plague had been around for a long time. The Greeks even wrote about it. It attacked the lymphatic system that runs through your system like your circular system does. The lymphatic nodes would swell to the size of an egg to an apple. Can you imagine walking around with your lymph nodes under your armpits with an apple or an egg size boil underneath them? The boils would seep blood and pus, and they smelled terrible. You would get fevers and chills, and then vomit, and then terrible pain, and labored breathing, and then you died. It was hard to see light for freedom at the end of the tunnel when you're in pain and grieving. In the middle of all this, they did learn some better sanitation eventually. And eventually they were able to burn out the infection and got rid of the plague and started recuperating. But there were much fewer of them in number. Now, there's another part of the history here that we need to talk about. What's going on here in the 1200s? You remember King Richard from the Robin Hood stories, that he left his brother John to be the king, and he went to on the Crusades to save Jerusalem. That era, when the Islamic countries had taken over Jerusalem, that was the sultans had led that, and their headquarters were in Egypt and Syria. And the Ottomans came in the 1300s after the sultans had fought with many of the people from Europe over Jerusalem. It had set them back a little bit. And as they recuperated, the Ottomans took over the Islamic countries, and they took over with a vengeance. They took the Middle East, and they took the top part of Africa straight across from Egypt over to where Morocco is now, and then where the Straits of Gibraltar is, and that's that little bit of water between Morocco and Portugal up into Europe. And it's just a small little strip of water. And they took that over too. And they went up to and took over Portugal and Spain and were trying to go over the Pyrenees Mountains into France. And France sent a lot of people there to fight them. And those people had a lot of freedom fighting in them. That's what they wanted, was their freedom. They didn't want the Ottomans taking over. And so they fought them back. That Pyrenees Mountains that separates Spain and France has been a border dispute area for generations. It's a beautiful part of the country. These Ottomans built beautiful buildings. They are notarized for their arches and their mosaic tiles and fountains, and a lot of them are still standing today, and they are beautiful structures. The Spanish and the Portuguese languages were influenced by the Ottomans as well. By the 1400s, the Ottomans had been pushed out of France, Portugal, and back to the top part of Africa. During these wars that France had with the Ottoman Empire, England took advantage of this weak spot for France and started the 100 Years' War with them, which set the stage for, Joan of Arc. She is our next person of influence that came during this time frame. She was born in 1412 as a peasant, uneducated, 5.5-foot girl. And she was, she probably stood a very poor chance of being an influence to anybody, mainly because she was uneducated, she was a peasant, poorly dressed, and a girl. People would not listen to her. But they did listen to her. At age 14, she started hearing voices and claimed to have had heavenly messengers speak to her. She said Archangel Michael told her she needed to save France from the 100-Year War with England, and that Charles VII needed to be king. And she had a hard time convincing the military of this. But she finally did, because of some miraculous things that happened. She dressed like a man and wore armor and cut her hair and led men into many winning battles. And she lived to see Charles VII crowned king. She was captured by some English men, and she was tried for heresy and for intimidating a man. Matter of fact, that was the worst of things that back then. If you were a woman intimidating intimidating a man, she was burned at the stake, and her last words were, "Hold the cross high so I can see it through the flames." Back then and today, people would say she was schizophrenic or was sleep deprived and delusional. There are a lot of events that happened that convinced the military to follow her. So you might want to do some research on that sometime and draw your own conclusions. As her story spread, people saw her as a spiritual leader of freedom. It was meaningful to them because she was a lowly girl with integrity. This inspired convictions in the people's hearts for religious freedom and political freedom. It made a difference. Another person that made a difference in this time frame was Johannes Gutenberg. He was born in 1440 in Germany. He invented the movable type printing press. He printed the Bible in Latin in more mass production. And this ended the control of information in Europe by the kings and priests. It increased literacy. It started the reformation of the religions, the renaissance of the arts, scientific discoveries, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Bringing education to the people opened their minds, and they started thinking like free men. A lot happened in the 13 and the 1400s that made people on the earth wake up to the thoughts of better life. Hope was in their eyes. We all have ancestors who lived through these years. A part of us inherited these genes to be brave, to be educated, to be seekers of freedom for a better life. May God be with you till we meet again.